deficits should never be allowed. Making up for them by printing money causes inflation, and financing them by borrowing from the private sector hurts economic growth by crowding out investment.
Those arguments are incorrect for governments who have sovereign currencies and flexible exchange rates. Deficits are almost always necessary to allow the economy to reach its max potential.
How can you believe that? The loanable funds doctrine clearly shows that crowding out occurs when governments borrow by selling bonds to the private sector. The loanable funds doctrine assumes that saving signals a desire to consume more in the future. Firms reassemble their production of capital goods to meet the future demand. Saving and investment are independent actions brought together by an interest rate managed by a financial intermediary. The interest rate adjusts to changes in the supply and demand for loanable funds until an equilibrium level is reached. When the government, in order to finance deficit spending, increases the overall demand for loanable funds, the interest rate rises in order to provide incentive for the supply of savings to rise. While the government is willing to pay the higher interest rate, some households and firms in the private sector will not be willing. Thus, government deficits crowd out private sector investment by decreasing their demand for loanable funds.
This argument is incorrect for many reasons. First, many flaws in the assumptions underlying the loanable funds doctrine were exposed by John Maynard Keynes way back in 1936. Keynes showed that saving and investment are not primarily functions of the real interest rate. Saving is a function of income. Investment is a function of future profitability expectations for a given level of investment. Profitability is based on aggregate demand. When expectations are high, firms invest in more capital and employ more labor to meet the future demand. Rises in employment raise incomes, and because a portion of incomes are saved, investment indirectly adds to aggregate saving. This indirect relationship is important because it allows for the possibility that current household saving need not equal current investment planning.
But if interest rates do not align saving with investment, then why do governments tend to sell a larger amount of government bonds to private sector banks during times of government deficits? Also, if interest rates are not controlled by supply and demand for loanable funds like in the loanable funds doctrine, then how are interest rates determined?
To understand why governments do this, you need to understand what happens when governments run deficits. But first, let's talk about how the banking system works. Private banks are required to hold a certain amount of reserves and are able to lend out any reserves above the reserve requirement. If lending causes a private bank to fall below the required level of reserves, the bank can borrow reserves from other private banks or from the central bank. The private bank must pay interest on the borrowed reserves. Lending between private banks is known as the interbank market. The total amount of reserves in the interbank market affects the interest rate that private banks agree to lend to each other on. If there is an overall shortage of reserves in the interbank market, then the decrease in supply relative to demand will cause the interbank interest rate to rise. The opposite occurs when there is an overall surplus of reserves in the system. The central bank of a nation can influence the amount of reserves in the interbank market by selling and purchasing bonds from private banks. Bond purchases by a central bank add reserves to the interbank market, and bond sales remove reserves. This in turn affects the interbank rate and all other interest rates, including the interest rate charged on loans for private sector investment. When governments run deficits, excess reserves are added to the interbank market. This causes the interbank rate and other interest rates to fall. Thus, the loanable funds doctrine has it backwards when it comes to deficits and changes in the interest rate. Bond sales occur more frequently during times of large government deficits in order to cancel out the fall in the interest rate caused by the government deficit. Bond sales aren't a borrowing operation. They allow the central bank to control the interest rate. These arguments are most applicable to nations that have sovereign currencies and flexible exchange rates. This is because these conditions provide a government with complete control over fiscal and monetary policy and allow a government to pay any and all debt held in their own currency.
Oh, suppose your arguments are correct. For a nation that runs under this financial and government structure, what would you recommend? Consistent deficits without bound?
No, that is not what we would recommend. Based on the work of John Maynard Keynes, we understand that fiscal spending contributes to aggregate demand. We also understand that inflation can occur if aggregate demand rises above the max output potential of a nation. We also don't advocate that the budget should never be balanced or in surplus. We recommend following the principles of functional finance. The main principle of functional finance is that fiscal and monetary policy should be focused toward targeting a level of aggregate demand that generates a level of output that fully utilizes a nation's resources. If deficits generate a level of aggregate demand that exceeds full employment, government spending should decrease, and if aggregate demand is below the level that generates full employment, government spending should be increased. Furthermore, the central bank should purchase and sell bonds in a way that maintains an interest rate that generates an optimal level of investment. As deficit owl Stephanie Kelton says, it's about balancing the economy, not the budget.
Well, that doesn't sound like such a bad way of doing things. You may be right.